Hello and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to this session where we are going to cover all the important environmental laws which are present in our country. And that becomes very much relevant for the prelims examination, but also relevant for your mains examination. Now, when we say environmental laws in the country, there have been questions asked about certain schedules of the Wildlife Protection Act, the case of the Environment Protection Act, the case of the Air Act, Biodiversity Act, and so on. Oftentimes, candidates don't know what are the major provisions there and how to approach them. This is your one stop solution, and in this short video, we are going to cover not only the environmental laws but also the up to date amendments. So, what are the laws that we are going to cover? So, first of all, Wildlife Protection Act 1972, and we are going to cover it in a chronological order. Then, after that, Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1974, Forest Conservation Act 1980, and its subsequent amendment, which has happened as late as 2023. Air Prevention of Pollution Act 1981, Environmental Protection Act 1986, and the derived aspect from the Environmental Protection Act, that is the e waste management rules, the coastal regulation zones, as well as the plastic waste management rules, the solid waste management rules. That is also something that we are going to discuss, and the Biodiversity Act 2002. So, all of this, you will get that in a comprehensive manner in this one video. So, here, first of all, starting with the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Now, this slew of measures about environmental conservation laws associated with wildlife, pollution, and so on, all of that has its genesis from the Stockholm Conference. The Stockholm Conference, which was held actually in 1972. India was an active participant in the Stockholm Conference. And after this, you basically had the formation of international organizations like United Nations Environment Program, and also the World Environment Day would be celebrated to commemorate the hosting of this Stockholm Conference. In fact, across the globe, the multiple different conventions that you come across, from CITES to CMS to the case of the Rio Conventions, the Kyoto Protocol, Montreal Protocol, all of them have their genesis of the discussion which was held in Stockholm Conference. In fact, in Stockholm Conference, there were triple threats to humanity which were identified, and triple threats to the overall well-being of the ecosystem which were identified. Which were those triple threats? First important threat was the loss of biodiversity. That was a major threat. Loss of biodiversity. Then after that, increased pollution. And then after that, the impact of climate change. That is why you will observe that all the laws and the conventions, they also follow a similar spectrum. Now, Wildlife Protection Act was passed in 1972 in order to protect the wildlife of our country, in order to prevent the illegal trade in wildlife, prevent hunting, which was very predominant in many parts of the country, and in order to ensure that stringent and strict penalties are imposed on the people violating the laws of the wildlife. Under the provisions of the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, you had the establishment of the national parks, the wildlife sanctuaries, even for that matter, the tiger reserves. They gained the legitimacy and the establishment from the Wildlife Act. Other than that, when we talk about the community reserves, the various different overall protected areas, they have their origin and legitimacy, which is gained from the Wildlife Act 1972. Now, when this act was passed, basically the various different schedules were arranged and there were multiple different sections. For example, the sections would define the role of the chief wardens and also the importance of the national parks, what are going to be the wildlife sanctuaries, what are going to be the national parks, this delineation. For example, wildlife sanctuaries are going to be in general species specific, to conserve a particular species. There will be more human activities which will be allowed in these wildlife sanctuaries. National parks, on the other hand, will have a greater degree of protection, conservation, and will target the larger conservation of the natural landscape. So, these kind of differences and distinctions were included, and the role of the chief wardens, etc., in certain sections like Section 38, that was clearly delineated. But more important than that, which was asked in the UPSC prelims as well, is the case of the schedules of the Wildlife Protection Act. Now, when it was passed and promulgated at that point of time, you basically had the 5 to 6 schedules. In fact, the sixth schedule was later on added as an amendment. Now, if you observe here, the species which were listed under Schedule 1, they would be provided maximum amount of conservation, strictest of the penalties would be imposed. So, for example, tigers, lions, then, for example, the case of leopards, or even certain species of birds, avifauna, all of them, which would require urgent attention, they would be placed under Schedule 1, like Great Indian Bustard and so on. Schedule 2, this was divided into Part 1 and Part 2. Here also, the protection level would be high, but not as high as the species listed under Schedule 1. Schedule 3 and 4 would deal with the protection of the species, the big game and the small game species as they would be referred to. Now, this big game and small game would be a terminology which would be provided by the Britishers for hunting purposes. So, there would be some leniency in the conservation of these particular species, but still there would be restrictions. Species or Schedule 5 would treat with vermins. What are vermins? Vermins would be those particular unwanted species. So, in particular state, for example, let's suppose a nilgai has created a lot of havoc in the farmlands of that state, or monkey population creating havocs in the apple orchards of Himachal Pradesh. In those cases, the chief conservator of the forest and the forest department of the state would raise this issue with the center to declare that particular animal as a vermin, and selective culling of some of these and trapping of some of these. After given permit, only then that particular species, and that too in that limited state for a particular area and a time, would be declared as a vermin. So, vermin would be unwanted species. It would not be uniform across the country, would be restricted in certain parts only. Schedule 6 was a new schedule which was added, that was for the plant species. This is an exception which UPSC has asked in the prelims examination or earlier also, that Schedule 6 deals with what? Not because UPSC expects you to retain all the schedules, but it wants you to know about the exception. Now, the amendment which were brought in, for example, the latest amendment has rationalized the number of schedules to 4 out of 6. So let us take a look into that. But before that, the other amendments. So here, one of the first amendments in 1991 added the Schedule 6, right? That is inclusion of the plants. That was done in 1991 amendment to the Wildlife Protection Act. Then you have the Central Zoo Authority, which also gains its legitimacy from the Wildlife Protection Act, that was created in the as per the amendment of 1991. Then another amendment was made in 2002, which thereby added the community and the conservation reserves under the ambit of the Wildlife Protection Act. And the penalties for violation and hunting of the wildlife was made much more stringent. Criminal aspects were included into that. Now, in 2006, another major amendment happened, and here National Tiger Conservation Authority was created as a statutory organization, and that provided more power and more teeth to the case of NTCA. Tiger reserves and their management also were included under the ambit of the Wildlife Protection Act itself. Another organization which was created as per the amendment of 2006 was basically Wildlife Crime Control Bureau. So these particular organizations and their creation, that becomes relevant for your prelims. Now, in recent times, a major amendment happened in 2022. And this was done in order to implement the provisions of CITES. CITES basically meaning Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna. Now, this was a convention which was signed in 1973. Today, we celebrate World Wildlife Day on 3rd of March to commemorate the passing of CITES. Now, in order to implement the provisions of CITES, in order to have stringent and more stricter control in the transfer and the trade of the animals, That is why you had the amendment which was brought in. Also, some of the penalties were made more stronger and more stringent. A scientific organization and a body was created in order to understand the role of these particular species on the larger biodiversity. Now, rationalization of the schedules. Schedule 1 still remains the same, highest protection for the animal species. Now, Schedule 3 and 4, they have been merged. Earlier, what was under Schedule 3 and 4, that was merged and created into Schedule 2. Schedule 3, protected plants, and a separate schedule for the species listed under CITES. Here, you have the elimination of Schedule 5, that is vermins. That category has been removed from the Wildlife Protection Act as per the 2022 amendment. Invasive alien species, Section 62 of the Wildlife Protection Act 1972 was amended to increase the powers provided to the central government in order to prohibit the import, trade, or possession of invasive alien species like eucalyptus, like red-eared slider turtle, water hyacinth, and so on. So these were some of the amendments done to the Wildlife Protection Act under 2022 amendment. Now, before we move on to the Water Act, an announcement for all of you preparing for the examination for next year and beyond. This is the time when you initiate the preparation and you set a long term foundation. So, here we have come up with the lucrative price offer of 17,999, and that is where you get an opportunity to prepare to the best of the syllabus with the best of the faculty members. You have to use the code IES English, and you are basically eligible for this lucrative price plus 6 months of free extension. And you also have the cost friendly prep at an EMI, which is quite affordable. So start the preparation today. The offer is ending tomorrow. Now, after that, the next law which was passed after 1972 was the Water Act 1974. Now, this was one of the first acts to control the pollution levels in the country. Now, this Water Act 1974, it also led to the creation of one of the statutory organization, that is CPCB, Central Pollution Control Board. Eventually, the powers of CPCB was increased to control air pollution, noise pollution, the all the different types of pollutions that would be controlled and monitored by CPCB. Plastic waste management, e-waste management, CPCB run portals. But however, the Water Act dealt with the Central Pollution Control Board, the creation of the State Pollution Control Board also. Now, the industries would require consent to establish, whereby they need to file that whether they are fulfilling all the required criteria. Consent to operate as well is something that the companies would need to file with the CPCB. CPCB and the SPCB would give them the clearance, and then that would be allowed. Prohibits discharge of pollutants beyond standards. SPCB is empowered to inspect and sample the effluents, and penalties were imposed on any kind of violations. Now, this was amended. 1988 was a major amendment. It was amended eventually in 2024 as well, but not such a major amendment. There was an amendment of the Water Cess Act, which was done in 1977. But as per the amendment of 1988, strengthened the powers of CPCB and SPCBs further, introduced stricter penalties, and the boards were empowered to close the polluting industries. After that, you had the Forest Act. Forest Act of 1980 was actually a follow up to the Forest Act of 1927. As per the Forest Act of 1927, now that was basically created or implemented by the Britishers. The Britishers, when they brought in the Forest Act of 1927, their aim was to regulate and restrict the access to the forests for the local population, the indigenous population, because in their worldview, the forests were being destroyed by the local indigenous communities. So that is where in 1927, they basically framed the entire thing to prevent the entry of the local community, and they created the case of the reserved forests. Okay, so the concept of the reserve forest has its genesis in the Forest Act of 1927. However, post independence, the deforestation was huge. A lot of forest land was being diverted for mining and other purposes. In order to prevent that, The government passed the Forest Conservation Act 1980. In this, the approval was required by the central government if you wanted to de-reserve any particular forest or you wanted to divert a forest for mining, industries, road, any of the purposes. That is where you needed to have the approval of the central government. Now, compensatory afforestation would be required wherever, let's suppose, you are setting up an industry, you're cutting down the trees. Compensatory forest would require to be set up. Advisory committee would be set up to examine the proposals for the diversion of the forest. Only then a forested land would be diverted. Having said that, despite these provisions, many of the state governments circumvented the rules. They would change the definition of what would qualify as a forest, and that would allow them to declare a region as a non forested area, and then diversion would be allowed. One of the famous cases emerged in the region of Tamil Nadu, where diversion of forest land having lot of teak trees, that was being done. That is when you had T.N. Godavarman, who went to the Supreme Court. And that is when you basically had the very landmark judgment, the Godavarman judgment of the Supreme Court, which was passed on 12th of December 1996. That is the judgment day of the Godavarman case. Godavarman case. Now, this judgment, where Supreme Court said that regardless of the fact that whether an area is declared as a forest land or a non-forest land, you should not carry out deforestation. After all, the aim is to increase the green cover and the forest cover and improve the ecological diversity of the region. So, why should we go ahead only with what is defined as a forest and what is not defined as a forest? In fact, if you want to go ahead with a definition, the Supreme Court said that go with the definition of deforestation. Any deforestation should not be allowed. Now, that created another set of problems. If any kind of deforestation or cutting of trees would not be allowed, then that means setting up of a railway line where trees would be cut would also not be allowed. That means setting up of a border outpost where trees are there, that would also not be allowed. So there were multiple different lacunae which were coming into the front because of this ruling of the Supreme Court. The Joint Parliamentary Committee submitted a report which said that many of the forested areas, there the tribal communities, they are not being able to achieve or not being able to get the required infrastructure like drinking water, sanitation, etc., because cutting of trees would be required. So, in order to remove that lacunae, there were amendment done in 2023. But before that, 1988 amendment tightened the diversion provisions, compensatory afforestation fund act 2016, that led to the operationalization and a mechanism for operationalization of the compensatory afforestation funds or the campa funds. But the more important fact is the amendment act 2023. Now, what it does is it basically exempts certain areas from the provisions of the Forest Conservation Act 1980. When you are exempting certain area from the provisions of the Forest Act means you are allowing for the cutting of trees in that area, you are relaxing the norms in that area. But which are those rules or which are those areas which have been exempted from it? So first of all, so here it makes it applicable only to certain types of land, which land notified as a forest under the Forest Act 1927 or in government records after the 1980 came into effect, which have been declared as a forest. However, the land which has been converted to non-forested area prior to the judgment of the Godavarman case, that land would be exempt. Because imagine if you have converted a land to, let's suppose, a mining land in 1988. Today, you bring it under the provisions of the Forest Conservation Act and you file a criminal case against the person, then that does not apply. That does not meet the criteria of natural justice. So that is why those lands were exempted. Other than that, the land in the frontier regions of the country, 100 kilometers from India's border, where vital defense establishments would be required, where you would have the border outposts, then the linear lands across the region of the highways, where you need to have certain roadside amenities, some important infrastructure in the forested area for drinking water supply, etc. Those were basically exempted. So this was the major provision. Other than that, the state government would require prior approval of the central government to assign any forest land to the private entity. However, certain activities could be allowed, such as zoos, safaris, and ecotourism. This was the major amendment done in 2023. It is still under litigation in the Supreme Court because of the diversionary activities done by the Haryana government, particularly in the region of Aravallis. Then, after that, you had the Air Act of 1981, Prevention and Control of Pollution. Now, this was very similar to the case of the Water Act, but here you had more powers given to CPCB. The major provisions are that it expanded the authority of the central and the state pollution boards, which were established under the Water Act for air pollution control. Those states which had not already established the SPCBs, they were required to establish the SPCBs now. Now, here, all industries must obtain the consent or the permit from the SPCBs. Now, the states are required to prescribe the emission standards for the industries which have to be adhered to. Now, the major amendment which was done in this case was the 1987 amendment. And as per the provisions of the 1987 amendment, noise pollution was included under the ambit of the Air Act. Noise pollution, okay, under the ambit of the Air Act. So it also allowed for citizen suit provisions and filing of the PILs and litigations by the individual citizens, introduced stiffer penalties, and extended the act to include noise pollution. After that, you had the Environment Act 1986. This was passed in the aftermath of the Bhopal gas tragedy, which shook the conscience of the entire nation. Now, this Environment Act of 1986 would be a central umbrella act which would increase the powers of CPCB, increase the powers of the central government, and would seek to control any and every kind of pollution thereby. So, here it would be the first environmental legislation to give the central government the authority to issue orders for closing down or basically shutting down the infrastructure like water supply, the electricity supply to any of the violating industries. It would grant immunity to officers who would be acting under the provisions of the Act. Let's suppose any company is polluting, any industry is polluting. Now, if I am an officer under the Environment Ministry or working in CPCB or SPCB, I use the provisions of Environment Act to shut down the industry. I cannot be penalized because of that. I will get a kind of an immunity. Other than that, you basically had multiple other notifications. That is the environmental impact assessment notification, coastal regulation zone notification, waste management rules, eco-sensitive zones, hazardous waste rules. All of them are basically monitored and have their genesis under the Environment Protection Act. Okay, so environmental impact assessment, you had the various different norms associated with that, coastal rules and coastal regulatory zones, all of them, solid waste management rules, plastic waste management rules, e-waste management rules, all of them have their genesis from the EPA. Now, coastal regulation zone. What is coastal regulation zone? Now, this was for the first time tried and introduced way back since 1991 under the provisions of Environmental Protection Act itself. It talks about limiting the development in the coastal areas, where you have the classification of the coastal areas under various zones. We will take a look at the zones as well. But here you would observe that under the new notification, the draft notification of 2018, you have the categorization and which kind of construction could be allowed. For example, here in CRZ1, generally construction is not allowed, but you have the permission granted for desalination plants, storage facility for the cargoes, project related to the Department of Atomic Energy. For these, the exceptions would generally be provided. CRZ2, CRZ3, like that, you had the classification. For your prelims, what is important for you to understand is the zonation. So, for example, the eco-sensitive zone in the coastal area would be regarded under CRZ1A. Intertidal zones between the low tide line and the high tide line, that would be classified under CRZ1B. CRZ2 would be the areas which have some habitations which have been developed closer to the shores, they also have certain regulations that need to be fulfilled. Then CRZ3, under the case of the CRZ norms 2011, you had one zone, that is CRZ3. The notification of 2018 bifurcated it into CRZ3A and CRZ3B based upon the population density. So here, CRZ3A population density is more than 2,161 per square kilometer. Now, there, more amount of infrastructure, drinking water supply, drainage, sewerage facilities, etc., could be allowed. So, CRZ3A and CRZ3B based upon the population density. CRZ3A, where population density is higher, CRZ3B, where population density is lower. Then CRZ4 has also been classified and bifurcated into two, CRZ4A and 4B. So CRZ4A is basically 12 nautical miles from low tide line towards the sea. Here again, you have restrictions of what you can do. CRZ4B, the tidal influenced water bodies like estuaries, the deltaic stretches, they would be covered under CRZ4B. And no development zone, that is the 50 meters from high tide line in CRZ3A areas and 200 meters from high tide line in CRZ3B areas. Mind you, CRZ3A, greater population density, CRZ3B, lesser population density. Then you had the Biodiversity Act of 2002. This was basically passed to implement the provisions of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the convention which was passed as per the Rio Summit 19 or 92. So you had the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was passed in 1992. Now, it had certain goals. What were the goals? First objective, the conservation of biodiversity. Second objective, sustainable use of various different products of biodiversity. Third objective, fair and equitable access and benefit sharing with the local community. Biodiversity Act also has got the exact three objectives. So it was simply to implement the norms of the CBD. Okay. So, for example, the Cartagena Protocol that talked about the living modified organisms, Biodiversity Act also includes that provision under the objective of it. So, like that, it was a mirror reflection for that. What it did, so it basically created certain organizations at the district level, national level, and the state level. At the national level, creation of National Biodiversity Authority. At the state level, state biodiversity boards. At the district level, biodiversity management committees. Now, here, anyone, all foreign nationals carrying out research in biodiversity and carrying the research somewhere else, they need to get approval from National Biodiversity Authority as well. Now, here, under the provisions of the Biodiversity Act, the biodiversity heritage sites which have been established across the country, that is under the provision of Biodiversity Act 2002. Now, some of the provisions under the case of Environment Protection Act, solid waste management rules of 2016 basically passed in order to have a better urban solid waste management. So here, segregation of waste at the source into wet waste, dry waste, domestic hazardous waste, that has further been subdivided as per the amendment in 2026. Now, door to door collection, scientific processing and disposal of the waste, user fee. If I'm disposing of the waste, I will have to submit a user fee as well. Waste to energy promotion, all of that was under the solid waste management rules. This was changed in 2026. This was done to target the bulk waste generators, like you have the government offices, the hotels, the educational institutions, all of them. Now, thereby, here mandatory legacy waste remediation, the dump sites, the dump yards that you have. Now, digital compilation system, extended bulk waste generator responsibility. And here it emphasizes on annual returns, filing of it about how much waste is generated, how much of it is treated, infrastructure planning, and scientific landfill management. Now, waste segregation was done at source at four levels: wet waste, dry waste, sanitary waste, and special care waste. Right? Wet waste must be composted or biomethonated, dry waste sent to material recovery facilities, sanitary waste wrapped and secured and stored separately, special care waste handed over to the authorized agencies. This was the changes which were brought this year. Then, Plastic Waste Management Rules 2016. Here, introduced the concept of EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, under the Plastic Waste Management Rules. It was, first of all, EPR was brought into India under which provisions? Let us know in the comment section below. Thickness of plastic carry bags were increased. Single-use plastics slowly and steadily were being phased out. Now, this has been amended multiple times. 2018, phase out of non-recyclable multi-layered plastic. Now, that was diluted. What was the target set under 2016? Companies were not able to meet that, so it was diluted. 2021 amendment, single-use plastic ban framework was introduced for the first time. Now, 2022, this ban was further extended. Ban on identified single-use plastic items implemented from July 2022. Then, 2024 to 2026, latest, the changes which have happened is that you have the tradability of the EPR certificates which were introduced under the 2022 rules. That means all the extended producer responsibility certificates that could be tradable in the market, which allowed for greater efficiency. Now, under the changes in the norms of 2026, here, the targets given to the companies that have been relaxed. Okay, now it has been progressive target, but also the filing on the portal has been made more stringent. The portal will be managed by CPCB. Now, stricter traceability and certification requirements have also been there. Then, at last, e-waste management rules 2011, it for the first time, there, it basically introduced EPR and the first dedicated e-waste regulation. Now, here it was changed and amended in 2016 and expanded the EPR provisions. It introduced the producer responsibility organizations, and targets were fixed to the individual organizations. Now, here the collection targets were changed by the amendment. Major change happened in 2022. Along with the plastic waste management rules, here also the EPR certificates were made tradable. That is, you could trade, right? The EPR certificates which are there, you basically could trade them. Again, introducing market forces. Here, photovoltaic cells were added, and the norm was introduced to improve the skill level of the workers in the region and to nudge the producers in order to go for eco-friendly production and not use materials like lead and mercury in the electronic items. The central portal monitored by CPCB was also introduced under the norms of 2022. So digital EPR system introduced, registered recyclers only, and you have to register on the central portal monitored by CPCB. Environmental compensation to be filled by the organizations for non-compliance, and it expanded the list of the electronic items to include photovoltaic cells, all the major changes which have been brought about by the solar industry, etc., that have been brought into the place. Now, there are some other norms as well, such as the biomedical waste rules, etc., hazardous waste, battery waste management rules. Not very important for your prelims. These are the ones which are important. Just revise them, make short notes from this, and you will clear the questions asked in the prelims examination. I hope this has helped your overall preparation of the prelims. If you have liked the content, put that in the comment section below. Let me know which rule introduced the EPR norms, extended producer responsibility norms, for the first time in our country. If you have liked the video, don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.